So I'm here with some early thoughts about the 2015-2016 team policy debate topic for Stoa. But to keep my administration and our admissions department happy, I'm going to take just about 30 seconds and plug Northwest Christian University. We offer scholarships for people who've competed in forensics, $2,000 renewable annually, and it's written into our scholarship that preference is given to people who competed in Stoa or NCFCA. So if you apply and someone from the NFL or TOC circuit also applies, you get consideration ahead of them. So when it comes time to shop for a college, keep us in mind. Okay, trade policy toward Asia. What I love about this topic is it's almost word for word the topic I debated when I was a junior in college. Our country list included Hong Kong, which China has since reabsorbed and is now trying to digest. And we used substantially change rather than significantly reform. But other than that, this is the topic. And before I go any further, the other thing that I want to plug is something I plug every year, which is don't sit in a room and use your imagination to dream up what the issues are going to be and then try to find evidence on that. Instead, go and browse. Go and find some good, scholarly, credible publications that are about Asia and that do a lot of coverage of trade policy, and go through article by article, read a lot of article titles, read a lot of first paragraphs, and get an idea what's out there and let that guide you. Now, I've done kind of a quick and dirty version of that. And originally what I was going to do with this video was I was going to do the complete brainstorm, and I was going to do a quick drive-by of about 500 different things. But then I realized a lot of it was borderline insulting. I mean, I was telling you, be sure that you read up on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and don't forget the South China Sea. And if any of you do even rudimentary extent, you probably know that for a trade policy topic for China and Japan, you need to talk about the South China Sea, and you need to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So what I decided to do instead was focus a little bit, and based on my preliminary reading of what is out there, here are some directions that I think you want to get on top of early. And I think you want to do a lot of background reading and become kind of experts on these, because I think that where we are right now in the development of these controversies, they're going to be pretty strategic places to begin your arguments, and you're probably going to hear about them a lot, either as affirmatives or as broad spectrum negative arguments throughout the season. The first thing to say is, I think that this is going to be the energy topic. I think that a whole lot of affirmatives are going to have to do with energy. First of all, there's a fair amount being written about the United States exporting liquefied natural gas to Asia. It's the kind of thing that is sort of being hammered out at this point. The big strides forward in fracking technology, the fact that the United States has so much natural gas now, and if you read about this, a lot of the topic countries' economies, they are so well suited to having their energy needs served by a good, reliable, steady source of reasonably priced liquefied natural gas. Go and read up on that, and I think that there's an affirmative there. And even if not an affirmative there, I think that if a lot of affirmatives that do this or that to optimize the trade negotiation process, to open up markets to where everyone's exporting more smoothly and everyone's profiting and their economies are growing, that's going to mean more energy consumption. And one of your broad spectrum negative arguments could be fluctuations in the price of natural gas based on spikes in economic growth. So go look for United States natural gas and Asia, United States natural gas and the topic countries, and I think you're going to find there's a lot of potential there. Similarly, there's an article I want to send you off to get a look at. It's by David P. Vincent, and it comes up in a Scholar Google search, so you can find it on Lexis, but you can also find it if you don't have Lexis. Here's the title of it: The Global Cost of Green. Recent trade issues and litigation between the United States and China may dissolve global green cooperation. It was in the William and Mary Environmental Law and Policy Review in the fall 2014 issue. And the argument that David Vincent makes, he says that China has been trying to expand its solar power industry because they know that burning all the coal they do, all the dirty energy production they've got, that's largely what's behind the horror stories that you read about in the news, where people working in a skyscraper in China can't see the building across the street because the air is so thick. And there are all sorts of consequences, all sorts of harms and impacts to come off that phenomenon. And he says in the article that something that's getting in the way of China expanding its solar industry is the United States trade complaints. that the subsidies that China is offering its solar manufacturers, that the United States is hauling them up before the WTO, but that the United States is also engaging in some of its own kind of illicit practices. And Vincent makes the argument we have potential for China and the United States to cooperate on renewables, and it is being squandered because of the United States strategy for trying to get an advantage in this industrial sector by churning up trade disputes with China, which I think is an affirmative waiting to happen. I think it's an affirmative that would have a lot of judge appeal. I think it's an affirmative that would create an opportunity for very powerful cooperation between the United States and China. That's got lots of spin-offs rhetorically that you can take advantage of. So go and get that article and get a good look at it, because I think that's got a lot of potential. The third thing to say about energy is for both Japan and South Korea, there are lingering nuclear power issues to talk about. 25 years ago, when I debated this topic, a popular affirmative was the Japan Plutonium Agreement, and even to this day, Japan has a worryingly large plutonium stockpile. And I did not actually stumble across anybody who had a proposal for what the United States ought to do about that. But that's something that you ought to go and do some reading about, because there is danger of accidents, there's danger of misdirection for terrorism and proliferation. That's just something that I bet sometime during the season you're going to hear about Japanese plutonium. Similarly, with South Korea, the South Korean Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreements. Go and try to find the 4 or 5 most recent articles talking about it, because the little bit of scanning I did suggested that all is not well in the agreement that South Korea and the United States have about its nuclear power industry. So, I think the first theme that I see coming up out of this topic is that it's the energy topic. And if you get on top of debating energy early on, I think that's going to pay some rich dividends. The second thing, well, this is, from here on, it gets to not themes so much as individual issues that I think you probably want to take a look at. One of the ones that really jumps out at me is the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. The Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. China proposed launching it a few years back after so many of the other development agencies had shown themselves to be so corrupt and completely incompetent, and the United States tried to put its foot down and say no, and we have made complete fools of ourselves, and all of our allies are backing China up and getting this enterprise going. And so there are lots and lots of commentators who are now offering proposals for how we can do damage control, for how we can undo the frankly ineffective and kind of dumb thing that we did and turn this to at least salvage some of what we should have had in the first place, even if we can't turn it to our advantage. And this is something I know from all my years in debate. One of the hardest affirmatives to beat is an affirmative that is predicated on someone's irrational act. When someone writes their affirmative around, this government agency did this thing that makes absolutely no sense, and so our proposal is to fix it. Right down at its core, it becomes very, very hard to be negative, because you're having to defend stupidity. And I think that if you go and read up about how this whole controversy developed over the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and if you look at some of the proposals for what the United States ought to do now, I think you could have one of those affirmatives where at the heart of it, you on the affirmative are saying, look, we were dumb, let's fix it. And that is a strategically very, very valuable position to be in. Now, something that's not quite as precise, a little bit more broad, but this is something I propose out of my past experience with a trade topic. Trade relationships are fundamentally, they are rivalries. They're almost like sibling rivalries. They should be healthy relationships that draw people closer, and one thing you'll probably see a lot of evidence written about in your research over the next year is that when you've got healthy trade ties with a country, it makes it that much less likely you'll wind up in a military confrontation with them. That was the logic behind the European Union, to so enmesh France and Germany in this network of trading relationships they would never go to war again. But it's still the case that both sides in the trading relationship are trying to come out ahead. Both are trying to sell to the other. So that's not necessarily a very cooperative relationship, it's a very competitive relationship. And so what I think you ought to have as kind of your perceptual filter as you're reading articles and as you're thinking about affirmatives and debate arguments is, what does this do to the balance, the web of relationships between the United States and the 4 topic countries? And what I jotted down as one of my early notes is, if the United States has a successful trade negotiation with South Korea, what does that do to South Korea's relationship with China? Does that pull South Korea away from China? Because I guarantee you're going to find things written about how China is courting South Korea and is trying to build a really, really healthy trading relationship with South Korea in ways that it didn't in the past, and that it sees the United States as a threat. Not a threat, not the kind of threat to be confronted, but as a rival. Not only does China want to be South Korea's biggest market, but China is not real happy when South Korea is expanding its trade channels, its trade output with the United States. So, I can tell you a story from back when I debated this topic before. The team that won the national debate tournament that year, one of the things about trade policy is that you'll find that there are a lot of, there's a really good literature for solvency mechanisms, for trade negotiations, for trade pressure, and so forth. And so, if you go at it the right way, there's going to be a really healthy, robust solvency turn debate. That's what happened that year. The team that won nationals on Elam Day, they were negative in every single round. Now, in 2015, that may sound like it's kind of a good position to be in Stoa, but in NDT debate in 1991, we were in a period in history where affirmatives won just about all their debates. You would lose maybe 1 or 2 affirmative rounds all year if you were one of the top teams. But this team, they were negative in every Elam round, and they won all of them. And what they did is they had solvency turns in every debate that they won. But I bring it up in the context of this rivalry discussion I was having a few minutes ago, because the other argument that they trotted out in every debate was the triangle argument. And the triangle argument was the United States, China, and Japan. They're close to one another, but they're also keeping one another at their distance. And what the affirmative plan has the effect of doing, it has the effect of pulling 2 of them closer together, which pulls the others further apart. And what was very strategic about that disadvantage was, if you tried to link turn it, if you tried to say, no, we don't pull Japan closer, we push Japan further away, they would say, well, that's bad too. The healthiest relationship, the relationship that lets the world economy run smoothly, is when we have healthy relationships built on rivalry. So they're close, but they're also distant. There's a dynamic tension in those relationships. So if I were you, I would watch for that. You're going to get, I think, a lot of mileage, both on the affirmative and really on the negative, out of we draw this nation closer, we sort of push this nation away, we put pressure on this nation, and that's a good thing or that's a bad thing. Okay, a couple of other things that go back to being slightly more specific issues. One of them is space. I think in addition to being the energy topic, it's possible that this could also be the space topic. I know that China is making big strides forward in launch services, and I know that the United States does not currently have the best options when it comes to how to get our payloads into orbit, that the European Space Agency is not quite where they had hoped that they would be at this point, that depending on Russia is a little bit dicey. Our scientists tend to get along with their scientists, but our government is not getting along that well with their government. So even though the United States and China look at each other suspiciously when it comes to geopolitics, the progress that's been made on economic issues means if you go looking for the potential for the United States and China to optimize their relationship when it comes to space, then you might find that there's a good affirmative there, or possibly the guts of a good broad spectrum negative argument. Similarly, an issue that comes up on trade topics a lot, I'm going to give you the word co-development. Co-development. Back in 1991, there were a lot of military programs that involved co-development. The United States was in an ongoing project with Japan to develop a new fighter plane, the FSX fighter. And today, the co-development that's being written about a lot more is the United States and Japan are co-developing technologies that have to do a little bit more with space. Some are tied to missile defense, but I saw at least a couple of articles speculating on whether Japan should be admitted to participation in the Joint Space Operations Center, along with several other of our allies that we've been coordinating our space efforts with all along. That might wind up being a good affirmative. Let Japan into JSOC. So, space is another thing you want to keep your eye on. And the final thing that I'll point out, I hope that this is the kind of thing that you try to avoid. But it could be the kind of thing that, given the opportunity, especially early in the year while you're still getting your legs under you, you can bring back the past 2 topics. Because you probably know this already, but overfishing, abuse of dolphins, and whaling, those are all still issues being worked out between Japan and the rest of the world, which can mean between Japan and the United States. And then cybersecurity. Cybersecurity and internet governance. China is a huge party. They are, by some accounts, a huge culprit in cybersecurity breaches. And Japan and the United States have worked a good deal in the past on internet governance issues. So you may be trotting out some of the arguments from last year. I hope you don't. I hope you move on into greener pastures and newer issues and you get all the educational benefit, but it's a possibility. The last thing I had jotted down as a direction for you to think about was, I would say the affirmatives you're going to hear on a trade policy topic broadly construed fall into about three categories. And that is, you optimize the process, you use the process as leverage, you increase or decrease goods. Optimize the process, use the process as leverage, increase or decrease goods. Let me give you an example of each. Optimize the process. When I was debating this topic at the beginning of the year, we had an affirmative that took trade negotiations with Japan, and this is back at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, so trade relations with Japan had been really bad for a number of years. What our affirmative did is it took those trade negotiations and it made them very similar to the way the Federal Reserve Board meets. Completely walled off from any political pressure, completely insulated. And the argument we made was that the congressional deliberations, congressional input on trade policy had had two problems. It, first of all, was highly offensive to the Japanese. There was a lot of Japan bashing. There was a lot of very public complaint about how the Japanese were responsible for the United States economic doldrums, and a lot of leaders and even the public in Japan found that deeply offensive. But the other thing was, it wasn't effective. It absolutely failed as trade pressure. It did not have the effect of opening up their markets. So when we ran this affirmative and we took trade negotiations effectively behind closed doors, a lot of negative teams' first instinct was to say that we were taking a soft line on trade relations with Japan and we were going to let them keep their trade barriers because all the Japan bashing was a form of pressure. And we would link turn that. We would say, actually, going behind closed doors and negotiating rationally is a lot more effective as pressure. It is a lot more likely to get us concessions. So, optimizing the process. And I don't know what you'll find when you go looking. I do know that when it comes to China, that there is a particular form that the United States and China have, the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue. And if you go looking further enough, tucked into essays and collections, book chapters, into House hearings somewhere, you might find proposals for how, if we come at it with better cultural awareness, or if we take this different approach to trying to get concessions out of China, then it's going to be more effective. So you can optimize the process. A second kind of cluster of affirmatives is using it as pressure. And I know that, once again, talking about China, there are human rights issues having to do with Tibet, having to do with the Uyghurs. I know that there are also labor rights issues, not just with China, but conceivably with South Korea as well. And so one affirmative that you might hear is to use trade sanctions or the threat of tariffs, or maybe just going to the WTO with complaints to try to get some of these other nations to cut back on some practices that are abusive, and you can tie those to your case harms. And the third and final cluster, I would say, is to increase or decrease goods. And I've already talked about increasing good goods or decreasing bad goods. The affirmative I ran the latter half of that year, what we said was that, this is back not too long after the Accord, the Montreal Protocol had been signed to limit chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. And we had evidence that China was going to put on this big economic modernization push, and the thrust of it was putting a refrigerator in every home. And you know, they have 1 billion people, most of whom do not have refrigerators. And we said these refrigerators will release so much chlorofluorocarbons that it could completely wipe out all the progress we've made on protecting the ozone layer. And we had evidence that China had agreed that it would see to it that these refrigerators used CFC substitutes instead of CFCs, but only if the West subsidized it. Their argument was that the West got to industrialize and got to fully develop, taking advantage of cheaper technologies that polluted the environment. So therefore, if the West wanted China to spend the extra money to be clean, then the West needed to foot the bill. And that was our affirmative. We footed the bill. We subsidized CFC substitutes, and so China could go ahead and put a refrigerator in every home in China, but these would be refrigerators that didn't destroy the ozone layer. And our advantage was just ozone depletion, which could wipe out all life on planet Earth, and it was this spiffy, tight little affirmative, and we were very hard to beat on it. So you can increase goods, you can decrease goods, you can subsidize goods, channel the goods in the right direction. Those, I think, are some of the directions that you are going to, I think probably those are the broad categories of affirmatives that you're going to see. Optimizing the process, using the process as leverage, or changing exactly which goods flow through that process. So there are some ideas for you to start off with. If you, frankly, have had enough of team policy and you want to take a few weeks off, I can't say I blame you, but this is the time of year when you can just do some aimless reading and you can just fill in with the details, and then as you get closer to the season, that's when you can start thinking strategically, and out of all this background knowledge you've got, you can make some really smart choices where to go to have some arguments that are really hard to beat.